Somewhere on a battlefield in 9th century England, just before a Viking line charged, a small group of men stood apart. They wore no armor, were foaming at the mouth, and their eyes were fixed on nothing. Textbooks will tell you they were berserkers. These were the rage warriors of Norse legend. They supposedly felt no pain and no fear. What put them in that state? A mushroom, the red and white toadstool of folklore. For 2 centuries, that was the answer. A drug, a trance, a vanished cult of warriors lost to history. Then, ancient DNA was extracted from their bones. Modern toxicology reopened the case. Almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. The drug was not what we were told. The men were not who we were told. And more unsettling than that, they never actually disappeared. Their genes are still walking modern Norway. To understand what the evidence overturned, you have to first understand what the evidence was overturning. That means going back to the source material itself. It means going back to the body of medieval literature where the berserker first appears as a recognizable figure. The Old Norse sagas, written in Iceland and Norway from the 12th to 14th centuries, drew on oral stories that were centuries older. These texts describe berserkers in language that is remarkably consistent across separate texts written by separate authors in separate generations. The sagas show these warriors as a specific type with a clear job. That job was understood all over the Viking world. For example, the Ynglinga saga, put together by the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson in the early 13th century, talks about warriors who fought without armor. It says they were as strong as bears or wild bulls. They killed men with one blow and could not be harmed by fire or iron. Egil's saga, one of the most detailed accounts we have, describes its main character's grandfather as a man who turned into a berserker at night. His own family could not go near him. The Hrafsmal, a 9th century poem written to honor King Harald Fairhair of Norway, lists berserkers among the king's best warriors. It describes them biting the rims of their shields before combat and howling like animals as they advanced. The word berserker itself has been argued over for centuries. In Old Norse, it is a compound word. The second part, serker, clearly means shirt or coat, but the first part, ber, has 2 possible meanings. It could mean bear, suggesting the warrior wore a bearskin, or it could mean bear, implying the warrior fought without a shirt at all. Both ideas have supporters. The sagas describe both types. Some berserkers wore animal pelts, while others fought stripped to the waist, even in the cold. Their place in Norse society was complicated. On one hand, they were elite warriors. Kings used them as personal guards and as shock troops for big raids. The Hrafnsmal puts them in King Harald Fairhair's inner circle. Egil's saga shows rulers all over Scandinavia wanting their service. On the other hand, people feared and avoided them. The same text that praised their fighting skill also said they were dangerous to live near. They often attacked neighbors during fits of rage. Their own communities sometimes killed them after the war, once their use had ended. Several saga stories tell of berserkers being hunted down and killed in peacetime by ordinary farmers acting in self-defense. The berserker phenomenon was most common from about the 8th to the 11th centuries. Most of the records come from Norway and Sweden. Their battles spread across the whole Viking world, from the British Isles to Francia and into the eastern river systems of what is now Russia. After Scandinavia became Christian in the 11th and 12th centuries, the berserker largely disappeared from the records. Icelandic law codes from that time specifically made the practice illegal. Whatever system created, the berserker was taken apart within a few generations. The figure then moved from active warrior into legend. The sagas are consistent. They describe a physical state that is too specific to be made up. What triggered it, if not just a literary invention? For 1,000 years, the question was what triggered the specific physiological state the sagas consistently described. This puzzle lies at the heart of the berserker story. The descriptions in the sagas were simply too consistent to be pure fiction. They detailed shaking, foaming at the mouth, an apparent immunity to wounds, and then a profound exhaustion after combat. These were not just poetic flourishes. They painted a picture of a physical state, something that could be brought on in certain men, on demand, before a fight. Something pharmacological was happening. The state had a name. Men who entered it either returned, transformed, or did not return at all. The answer that took hold in textbooks throughout the 19th and 20th centuries came from an unexpected place. In 1784, a Swedish theologian and natural historian named Samuel Odman published a short paper. He proposed that the berserker rage came from eating Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric mushroom. This is the iconic red-capped, white-spotted toadstool common across the boreal forests of the northern hemisphere. Odman was no scientist. He was not a pharmacologist. He never tested the mushroom on a human. He never looked at Viking-era skeletons or analyzed chemical traces from Norse archaeological sites. What he had was a literary argument, and a comparative one. His reasoning followed two main paths. The first was geographic and cultural. Odman pointed to the documented use of Amanita muscaria by indigenous peoples in Siberia. Shamans from the Koryak, Chukchi, and Sami traditions used the mushroom for ritual trances and visionary states. He drew a line on a map from the Uralic peoples of Siberia to the Norse peoples of Scandinavia. He argued that the cultural difference between them was smaller than it seemed. He proposed that knowledge of the mushroom's effects could have traveled west into the Viking world. The same trade and migration routes connected the two regions. His second argument was pharmacological in the loosest sense. Odman had read reports of Siberian Amanita use. These described people feeling detached, seeing things differently, having less pain, and becoming agitated. He compared these to the saga descriptions of berserker behavior. He concluded the fit was close enough to publish. The theory was elegant. It explained the rage. It explained the foaming. It explained the apparent immunity to wounds. It linked the Norse warrior tradition to a wider Eurasian shamanic context. This appealed to the comparative scholars of the time. And it was easy to remember. A red and white mushroom with a dramatic visual signature, a warrior cult, a transformation into rage. The picture had narrative force. For 2 centuries, this became the accepted answer. Odman's idea appeared in encyclopedias, in popular histories, in academic studies of Norse culture. It showed up in school textbooks, in television documentaries. Eventually, it made its way into the imagery of fantasy literature and video games that used Viking themes. Every modern image of a mushroom-eating rage warrior, every drawing of a berserker holding a fly agaric, all trace back to that single 18th century Swedish theologian. He reasoned by analogy from a culture 3,200 kilometers east of Norway. He never tested his own claim. The theory lasted because nothing better replaced it. Throughout the 19th and most of the 20th century, we simply lack the tools to test pharmacological claims about past populations. There was no chemical residue analysis for Viking-era ceramics, no systematic forensic toxicology for skeletal remains, no archaeobotany capable of identifying plant material and burial sites with any real detail. Researchers studying the berserker had the saga text and scattered grave goods found early in Scandinavian archaeology. They did the best they could with the tools available. In the absence of evidence, an elegant hypothesis from 1784 held its ground. It was, in the most literal sense, a guess that had hardened into fact through repetition. The weight of 2 centuries of citations made the mushroom theory seem like established knowledge. By the late 20th century, it was hard to find a popular account of the Vikings that didn't mention Amanita muscaria as the chemical fuel for the berserker phenomenon. The idea became so deeply embedded in the cultural memory of the Viking Age that questioning it felt like questioning the Vikings themselves. The mushroom theory, for all its narrative appeal, did not survive contact with real science. Almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. Modern toxicology began to dismantle the idea in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. It did this by asking a simple question Odman never considered. What does Amanita muscaria actually do to a human body? Researchers compiled clinical literature from 2 centuries of medical case reports. They looked at both accidental and deliberate ingestion of the mushroom. The answer did not match the saga record at all. The active compounds in fly agaric are muscimol and ibotenic acid. Both are powerful neurotoxins. They act on the central nervous system. The effects they produce are well documented. The dominant symptoms include sedation, nausea, vomiting, and profuse sweating. Users often experience ataxia, which is a loss of muscle coordination. Confusion and slurred speech are common. In significant doses, it can cause unconsciousness. The mushroom is a depressant. It is not a stimulant. A man who had eaten Amanita muscaria in a quantity sufficient to alter his mental state would be more likely to vomit on himself and fall asleep than to charge a fortified shield wall in the front rank of a Viking army. The Siberian shamanic comparison, which had anchored Odman's theory for 2 centuries, also broke down under closer inspection. Researchers examined the ethnographic record of Amanita use among the Koryak, the Chukchi, and the Sami. They found a tradition of visionary trance, dream interpretation, and communication with spirits. They did not find any tradition of combat enhancement. The Siberian shamans who consumed the mushroom did so in stillness. They often lay down in a yurt or a tent. Attendants watched over their bodies for hours. They did not pick up axes and charge into battle afterward. The cultural function of the mushroom was the opposite of what the berserker hypothesis required. The pharmacological problem became impossible to ignore. The saga record describes warriors who showed dramatically increased physical capacity. They fought through wounds that would have stopped an ordinary man. They maintained coordinated combat performance for the duration of an engagement. They collapsed only after the battle had ended. Amanita muscaria does not produce that profile. It produces something closer to its inverse. It causes sedation, not agitation. It brings on nausea and stillness, not violent activity and pain immunity. By the early 2010s, researchers were actively looking elsewhere. If you find yourself wondering what plant could produce such a state and what physical evidence might prove it, subscribe. The answer changes everything. The leading alternative that emerged from this work was a plant, Hyoscyamus niger, known as black henbane. Henbane grows wild across northern Europe, including all of Scandinavia. Norse-era herbalists knew of it. Its active compounds are hyoscyamine and scopolamine. These are tropane alkaloids, the same chemical family found in belladonna and datura. They act on the body in a fundamentally different way than the muscarinic toxins in fly agaric. Modern toxicology cases document the clinical profile of henbane intoxication. The symptoms match the saga record almost exactly. Henbane causes severe agitation, not sedation. It produces vivid hallucinations, often violent or paranoid. It causes dramatic dissociation from pain. This is one of its most consistent reported effects in poisoning cases. It speeds up the heart rate, a condition called tachycardia. This brings flushed, hot skin. It also creates a distinctive symptom that appears repeatedly in saga descriptions of berserker behavior, foaming or frothing at the mouth. This happens because the body's normal swallow reflex gets suppressed. In the recovery phase, henbane causes a profound and prolonged exhaustion. This can last for days. It perfectly matches the post-battle collapse described in Egil's saga and other texts. The fit was not approximate. It was item by item. Where Amanita caused sedation, henbane caused agitation. Where Amanita led to nausea and stillness, henbane brought violent activity and pain immunity. Amanita had no documented combat tradition anywhere in the world. Henbane, however, produced exactly the symptom profile that Norse warriors had displayed for 1,000 years. Henbane fit, mushrooms did not. This raised an obvious question. If researchers had found the right plant, was there any physical evidence Vikings actually used it? The evidence came from the ground. In 1977, Danish archaeologists excavated a Viking-era cemetery at Fyrkat. This was a fortified, ring-shaped stronghold built during King Harald Bluetooth's reign in the late 10th century. They opened a burial that didn't match the others around it. The grave belonged to a woman, dated to about 980 AD. The goods buried with her showed she was a person of unusual status. She'd been laid to rest in a wagon body. This was a treatment reserved for only the highest-ranking individuals. She wore silver toe rings, an ornament unknown elsewhere in the Scandinavian record. She was buried with a bronze bowl from Central Asia. She also had a metal wand, the kind associated in saga literature with ritual specialists. And she had a set of objects the excavators couldn't interpret at first. Among them was a small leather pouch. Inside the pouch were several hundred seeds. When sent for identification, the seeds were Hyoscyamus niger, black henbane. This find established something the saga record had only implied. Henbane was deliberately collected, processed, stored in a sealed container, and buried with a person whose other grave goods marked her as a ritual practitioner. Most researchers now identify the Fyrkat woman as a volva, a Norse seeress. This category of ritual specialist appears in Eddic poetry. These women traveled between communities, performing ceremonies, interpreting visions, and administering substances that changed the mental states of those who consumed them. The Firkat burial was not an isolated find. Later excavations across Scandinavia have turned up henbane seeds in contexts linked to warrior burials, ritual deposits, and other high-status graves from across the Viking Age. Norse society was growing, harvesting, and curating this plant. The archaeological record consistently shows it in ritual, not domestic settings. This was not a kitchen herb. It was a controlled substance handled by specialists deployed for specific purposes. The forensic case for henbane grew stronger when researchers looked at how its documented effects matched behaviors described in the sagas. The fit was exact. The shaking mentioned before battle in the sagas lines up with the early agitation from tropane alkaloid poisoning. The foaming at the mouth, a repeated detail for berserkers entering their trance, matches how scopolamine suppresses the swallow reflex. Their seeming immunity to wounds during a fight fits with the dissociative analgesia that henbane creates in strong doses. And the total collapse after battle, plus the long recovery period that could last days, match the exhaustion phase of tropane alkaloid recovery. Egil's saga describes a berserker named Liot howling and biting his shield, then being out of action for days. The clinical literature on henbane recovery shows the same exact profile. This ritual use implied by the Firkat find also made sense of the sagas in a way the mushroom theory never did. The berserker in the sagas didn't just eat something on his own before a fight. He was part of an organized group. They came from specific families, served particular kings, fought in set formations. They went through initiation rituals that the texts mention but rarely explain. Having trained ritual specialists give out a dangerous plant fits this picture. A man eating a mushroom he found himself does not. The drug, in other words, was not a personal choice. It was a tool of a system. The henbane was administered, the dose was controlled, the recovery was managed. The warrior who came out of this experience was not acting alone. He was the output of an institution that had grown a plant, trained a specialist, prepared a ritual, and produced on demand a man capable of doing what ordinary men could not. The question about the drug was answered. But the men themselves still held a puzzle. For most of modern history, berserkers were seen as separate from regular Norse society. 19th and early 20th century scholars often suggested they were a distinct ethnic group. Maybe they came from an older population in northern Europe. Perhaps they were brought in from elsewhere in the Viking trade network. But in any case, they were thought to be biologically different from the farmers and fishermen who made up most of Scandinavia. The berserker, in this view, was not just culturally different. He was genetically other. This theory, like Odman's mushroom idea, was built without the evidence needed to test it. That evidence would arrive. This evidence arrived with the acceleration of ancient DNA analysis. Throughout the 2010s, this technology became powerful enough to reshape how we study prehistoric populations across Europe and the Americas. The work culminated in a major study published in 2020. An international team, based at the University of Copenhagen, sequenced the genomes of over 400 individuals. These came from Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia and the entire Viking diaspora. They spanned from Norway and Sweden to the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and even the eastern river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. This study overturned several long-held ideas about Norse genetic identity. The Vikings were not, as many had assumed, a single uniform Scandinavian population. The genetic record showed significant gene flow into Scandinavia. People arrived from southern Europe, the British Isles, and the Asian steppe throughout the Viking Age. This created a diverse society where individuals of vastly different ancestries lived, fought, and were buried side by side. Within this broader picture, researchers could now look at specific high-status warrior burials with incredible detail. Skeletons identified as elite warriors through grave goods, burial positions, and bone trauma patterns were examined. This included several burials interpreted as berserkers or members of similar fighting groups. These remains did not show the genetic signature that the older theories had predicted. They were not outliers. Their DNA was not concentrated in any unusual ancestry group. They carried no markers suggesting they came from a separate population. They fit squarely within the mainstream genetic distributions of Viking Age Norway and Sweden. They were indistinguishable at the ancestry level from the farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen buried in nearby graves. The implication was specific. The berserker was not a genetic outlier. He was not a foreign import or the descendant of a vanished tribe. He was a local man, drawn from the same population that worked the fjords and farmed the inland valleys. What set him apart from his neighbors was not his bloodline, it was the institution that had claimed him. The capacity for the berserker's rage was not in the genes, it was in the system. That system selected him, trained him, gave him the henbane, and sent him into battle. This finding inverted the question that had puzzled researchers for over a century. The interesting thing about the berserker was no longer who he was descended from. The interesting thing was what had been done to him. The transformation described in the sagas, the rage, the foaming, the immunity to pain, the post-battle collapse was not an inherited trait. It was the result of a pharmacological and ritual process. This process converted ordinary Norwegian men into a specific kind of weapon. The berserker, in this reading, was not a creature. He was a product. And the production line ran through specialists like the Fear Cat woman. She grew the plant, prepared the dose, and gave it to men whose ancestors had farmed the same valleys for generations. When the institution ended, the production line ended with it. But the men themselves and their genetic material did not disappear. Where their DNA went is the part of the story the title promised. It needs careful framing. The men went somewhere. Current genetic studies of Scandinavians now show exactly where. These studies look at tens of thousands of sequenced genomes from biobanks in Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. They prove a direct, clear line between Viking-age people and modern Scandinavians. The genetic difference between a 10th century warrior from Norway and a 21st century farmer there is almost nothing. It is statistically insignificant. The same Y chromosome haplogroups found in Viking-era warrior graves, including those identified as berserkers, are common in Norwegian men today. Researchers have even matched specific ancient DNA lineages to living descendants in the same areas where the original graves were found. The berserkers, as individuals, did not vanish when Scandinavia became Christian in the 11th century. The system that created them disappeared. The ritual specialist who handled the henbane was gone. The entire process that turned ordinary men into that warrior state ended within a few generations of the conversion. Icelandic law codes from that time clearly banned going berserk. But the men themselves did not disappear. They had children before the institution ended, and while it was still active, those children had children. This chain has stayed unbroken for the 1,000 years since the last berserker likely put down his axe. This finding sharply contrasts with how we remember berserkers culturally. In popular history, in fantasy, in movies and TV, the berserker is usually shown as a lost archetype. They are a creature of legend, extinct with the Viking Age. This image is like how we see the ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest or the Bronze Age cultures of the Mediterranean. Their disappearance is a main part of their story, but DNA tells a different story. The disappearance never happened. What ended was not a population, it was a practice. This difference is important. We need to be clear about it. The fact that berserker ancestry continues in modern Norway does not mean modern Norwegians carry some inherited rage. It does not mean descendants of berserkers are biologically different from their neighbors. The berserker rage was a phenomenon of culture and drugs. It needed the plant, the specialist, the ritual setting, and the social system that brought all three together. None of those things are in DNA. DNA only shows ancestry. It records who fathered whom, not what they did for a living. The berserker bloodline is not a monster's bloodline. It is simply a Norwegian one. What the genetic evidence shows is that the berserker, as a type of person, was never separate from the wider Norwegian population. He came from it, was changed by it, and returned to it when the system that defined him was gone. Men who survived raids, who survived the institution, who lived longer than most warriors in that role, settled back into their villages. They farmed the same valleys as everyone else. They married. They had children. The genetic trace of their families flowed back into the same population pool they came from. The men buried at Firkat and other sites with henbane and warrior remains are genetically direct ancestors of the people living in Norway today. There is no separate berserker family line that survived on its own. There is only the main population which absorbed them. DNA now confirms what demographics always implied. The berserkers did not go anywhere. They simply stopped being berserkers and went home. And their descendants are still there, in the same valleys, on the same farms, looking exactly like everyone else. Return to the battlefield. The foaming warrior, the figure stripped of armor in the front rank of a Viking line. The mushroom story, repeated for 2 centuries, was wrong. The drug was henbane. It was grown, stored, and given out by trained ritual specialists. The woman buried at Firkat, with hundreds of seeds in a leather pouch, was one of them. The berserkers themselves were not a separate people. They were not foreign elites. They were not a vanished tribe. They were ordinary Norwegian men. An institution transformed them. That institution no longer exists. Their descendants live in the same valleys their ancestors raided from. The real surprise of the berserker story is not the drug. It is the disappearance, and the fact that the disappearance never actually happened. The institution ended. The men did not. The only thing that ever vanished was the system that made them. The berserker was not a creature of myth. He was the product of a sophisticated, controlled system. His genetic legacy is woven into the fabric of modern Scandinavia. Subscribe for more deep dives into history and science.